Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're gonna do something a little different. After seeing a few other creators, and by other creators I mainly mean the absolute king that is TPPO art, do videos quote-unquote stealing other artists' styles to learn from their techniques, I decided I wanted to do one too. But unfortunately, I look up to a lot of artists, and because my brain is always fueled by 10 cups of coffee and screaming go hard or go home, I had originally planned to do the same piece you're seeing now in 15 different artist styles. Then I actually tried to do that on top of my other work and realized that, wow, I can't do that if I want to have this video up in the next year. Which I do, because number one, I personally want it up much sooner than that, and two, Patreon supporters voted for it as this month's topic, so, I gotta. As a result, I cut that number of artists down to 12, and I split them in half. In the video you're watching now, I'll be drawing this piece in 6 artist styles, and in a part 2, coming relatively soon, I'll be drawing a different piece in 6 other artist styles. If it's something you guys end up enjoying, I can keep the series going beyond just the 2 parts I have planned already, because I have no shortage of artists who inspire me. But if not, I'm honestly just happy I got to dedicate some real time to learning from my favorite artists. For this video, I'll be copying the styles, to varying degrees of success, of Hanavbara, Meyoco, Utomaru, Arkestar, Mochijun or Jun Mochizuki, and Raikoart. In part 2, I'll be copying the styles of Naoki Saito, Mike 9, Omocat, Hanabushi, Nemupan, and Brian Lee O'Malley. Oh, and also, for a much slower speed paint of the piece you're seeing now, check out my most recent video about League of Legends where it's the primary focus, because it's going to be really heavily sped up to just be in the background for this intro section. But that's more than enough rambling at this point, let's get started. The first artist I copied, Hanavbara, is known for their very retro anime style, which, as you can see, is pretty distinct. I've always loved their work because it makes me feel like I'm 7 years old and watching Sailor Moon again, which is convenient given that they draw a lot of Sailor Moon fan art. As you can see from my brief research notes here, some elements of their style that I broke down as particularly important are as follows. Their work is primarily cel-shaded, with the only highlighting present being the generally somewhat blocky hair highlights, and blending is almost never done, with some small exceptions made for backgrounds. They use a lot of bright, saturated colors, and almost always have a noise or grain filter over their pieces to establish that nostalgic retro vibe, as well as frequent use of chromatic aberration for the same purpose. Their line art is a fairly consistent, unchanging weight, without thickening in areas of shadow or lightening in areas of, well, light, and it's almost always black and not colored. Finally, they draw their subject's hair in more simplified shapes rather than individual strands. Equipped with that analysis, I did my best at recreating that style in my own interpretation, and hands down, my favorite part to work on was the eyes. I think the way they draw eyes is one of the biggest things to solidify the retro anime look in their work, and it's what I had the most fun with as a result. They do their highlights a little differently in every piece, but I decided to go with the way they did them in this Princess Peach piece that I was referencing primarily. There are also some pieces of theirs where the character's nose is just a dot, but more of the ones that I had saved as reference used the more triangle-y shape, so that's what I went with. Looking back, one thing I wish I could change is how I did the hair. This was the first redraw I did for this challenge, and I was still very much leaning on the original piece for key elements rather than experimenting with transforming them thoroughly to match the artist's style. This is something you'll see more of later on as I redraw my original sketches to change the hair to be more reminiscent of the artist's style rather than the original piece's style. But unfortunately in this case, I finalized the piece before realizing my mistake. It's not the worst, and I did simplify the hair down to shapes and not strands a little bit, but especially near the scalp area, where Hanavbara tends not to put much detail, I definitely did put too much detail. Next up was Meyoco, whose art makes up like 90% of my art inspiration Pinterest board, because you can't tell me their style isn't just chef's kiss. I've been unapologetically in love with their art for years now, so when I started planning this challenge, they were one of the first artists on my list to copy as a result. Looking at my research notes, I broke their style down into the following primary elements. Their line art does vary in weight or thickness based on light and shadow, and based on the way it kind of makes this little round boy dot in areas of shadow where the line clearly began, suggests the use of a ballpoint pen-like brush, simulating how ink tends to form a circular blot where the pen first meets paper. Their line art is also colored based on the color of specific areas like skin, hair, or clothing, but generally retains a consistent color for the entire piece's outline. Their color palettes are also very cold-leaning, but they often use stars and sparkles in warmer yellows to contrast them. They exclusively use cel shading, with use of gradients as well in some pieces, and shading is minimal if present at all, which it usually isn't in the hair. Speaking of, the hair is generally a major focus of their work, and not because it's particularly detailed. It's actually very simple, generally using basic shapes rather than detailed strands, something I ended up changing my original sketch to reflect. But it's a focus because it's super flowy, fluid, and movement-based, with a lot of very rounded, smooth shapes. And it creates a really dynamic element in an otherwise relatively completely flat style. With all of that in mind, as you've been seeing, I tried to make my own piece the same way. One thing to note right off the bat is that this is the only piece where I actually changed a key element of the original, that being the eye color, because I've never actually seen any art by Meyoco where a character's eyes aren't either black or closed. I'm sure a piece like that exists, I just haven't seen it myself, so I went ahead and changed the eye color in this one to reflect that. Beyond that, as I mentioned, after realizing that I went way too hard on the detail in the hair for it to be accurate to Meyoco's style, I revised the sketch to simplify it and also make it more flowy. I tried to change the background stars to be more reminiscent of the way they draw them in their own backgrounds, but I don't know how successful I actually was at that, honestly. I also tried to emulate the gel pen / ballpoint pen vibe by giving certain areas of the line art that little ink blot thing. I don't hate how this one turned out, but I do think the original subject matter played a big part in me not loving the final result. Meyoco doesn't do a lot of pieces with dark backgrounds or rim lighting, so doing a redraw of a piece with both didn't exactly set me up for success. In part 2, I'll be doing a much brighter piece, so I think for fun I might add another Meyoco styled piece to the lineup there too, just to give myself a better shot at doing it right. The next artist on my list was Utomaru, and good god was I so excited for this one. I first found their work in those Japanese illustration books that I hoard like precious gems, and ever since I've followed them closely on social media to quietly cry over their work. Their style is just so unique, to the point that you can see a piece and immediately be like, oh yeah, Utomaru made that. And I personally find that really impressive. According to my research notes, I broke their style down to the following elements. First and foremost, the color. They use aggressively bright colors, and they use a lot of them, to the point that if you look at some of their work, you might find yourself thinking, Jesus, these colors should clash so hard. This shouldn't look good, but my god, does it look good. I don't know how they do it. I still don't, even after trying to imitate it. They're just a god, I guess. They also mostly use black, uncolored line art through the majority of their work, and their line weight is mostly unchanging, although they frequently use the line art color to shade. I noticed after writing those notes that they also sometimes use a thicker line weight for the piece's outline, but both that outline and the lines within it are all still a set flat weight. They use simple cell shading with no airbrushing or blending whatsoever, and their highlights are limited almost exclusively to the hair and sometimes skin, and are generally quite blocky. Their characters are depicted with semi-realistic proportions within the retro anime style, and their eyes only have the top eyelid drawn, with little dashes as eyelashes denoting the bottom of the eyes. The eyes themselves are also uncolored aside from the pupil and iris, meaning there's no eye white, just a continuation of the skin tone. Using that, I made this, and I had so much fun with it. I think this was the piece I had the most fun with, actually, because it's so far from how I would normally draw. It's another case of me having to simplify the hair, which I'm going to be saying a lot in this video given how often it happened, and I think it turned out okay after that revision. One thing I forgot to mention in my notes is that they often do these little dashes at the end of some lines, so I tried to incorporate that in some areas of my own copy. I also gave the outer line art a thicker weight, because while they don't do that in all of their work, they do it in some, and I thought it would look good for this one. But by far my favorite part of this was the color. I still didn't go nearly as hard as Utomaru does in terms of vibrancy and variation, but giving myself permission to just say, I don't care if I think this will clash or not, I'm gonna try it, was awesome. I would personally never have chosen to shade the hair with a greenish tone or the purple with magenta given the tone of the piece, but somehow in Utomaru's style, I actually think it kind of works. This is one of my favorites, honestly, in large part just because of how much I enjoyed making it. Both this and Meyoco's really reminded me that simplicity in a style does not make that style less good than a complex one, just different. And actually, so did this next one, Arkestar. My wife was the one who got me into their work with the equivalent of babe wake up new retro anime style artist. I mean, new to us at least, not art as a whole. And I immediately fell in love with their style because my god is it unique. Like yes, it's got the retro anime vibe, but it's more than that, which you can tell just by looking at it. My research notes broke it down into the following. They often use very sharp angular shapes, particularly when it comes to eyes and clothing folds. Their line art is almost completely flat in terms of weight and can often be somewhat messy, with petted lines and space between where two lines meet, and is almost always black and uncolored. Despite the flatness of their line art though, they do thicken it occasionally to make shadows, generally under the chin and hair. This is usually a substitute for actual shading because other than the skin, almost nothing in their work gets any degree of rendering, either shadow or highlights. There are occasional exceptions depending on the piece, but even then, they usually only add some blocky highlights which are generally outlined in black unless it's on hair. Instead of shading areas of shadow with color, they often use a halftone brush in those areas instead. Their characters' eyes are frequently like two circles with a colored pupil in the center, which I think looks really cool and distinctive. Finally, they use really limited color palettes, those usually being made up of a lot of pinks, purples, and reds, contrasting vibrantly against their primarily black backgrounds. Based on that breakdown, I made this. Yet another instance of I had to make the hair simpler because I'm dumb, as you can see. For this one, the line art was the biggest challenge for me because I've always been a very, if this line isn't perfect, you have to redraw it kind of artist, and this style calls for basically the opposite of that. Because that's so far from how I normally work, I don't think I succeeded very well at all at conveying the more sketch-like line art typical of Arkestar, but I tried, and it was actually really helpful and almost therapeutic to not only let myself make imperfect lines and mistakes, but encourage myself to. The things I think I did best in copying their style were the facial features, largely because that's what I find so distinctive about the style itself. I used the 2 circle irises with the colored pupils, the very uniquely angular eye shape, kept all features very low on the face, and made sure to keep in the thing they do with noses and blush. They basically put a line across the nose and 3 lines on each cheek to effectively read as blush lines. For the nose, they sometimes put 1 or 2 vertical lines over the horizontal line, and as you might notice in the speed paint, I vacillated between whether or not I wanted to, and ultimately decided it looked better with just the 1 horizontal line. They also don't do hair highlights in every piece, so that was another thing I was iffy about including in my own piece. As you can see, I decided to leave the highlights in, although I'm still not sure whether or not that was the right choice. Overall, I had an awesome time working on this one, and while I don't love how it turned out, especially in terms of using too much halftone and not having messy enough lines, I do like it as a whole, and the experience was really valuable. Next up is Mochijun, a mangaka who ruined my life. Like, alright, yes, I read Pandora Hearts and it destroyed me. Then like 10 years passed and I thought, okay, I have healed from the emotional damage this mangaka inflicted upon me with that masterpiece. And then my wife was like, hey, you should read this new Mochijun manga, The Case Study of Vanitas. And my god, my heart was once again shattered into a million tiny pieces. And it's ongoing, so my suffering is indefinite. Regardless of that though, what's relevant here is that it's impossible to look at any of her manga covers and not think, my god, that art is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And it's because of her distinctive style. So let me summarize my research notes, breaking that down into its specific elements. First off, she combines cell shading with watercolor blending, which I believe is because her work is primarily done traditionally and then scanned, meaning it's actually watercolor. She often prioritizes soft shading over cell shading though, particularly on the hair and skin. Her line art is generally never colored, likely because she does primarily traditional work, and in terms of line weight, it doesn't often thicken in areas of shadow, but it does get thinner in areas of light. She has a very particular way of rendering hair that I'm telling you right now I did not do justice. Her style in general is very versatile and ever-changing, as is the case for a lot of artists, but one thing that's always very distinctive and recognizable is the sharp, angular way she draws eyes, which remains consistent throughout all of her work. Using that analysis, I did my best. Honestly, I do not think I did her style justice at all, but I did my best. It's really, really hard to emulate the style of a traditional artist in a digital medium, and even harder to try to emulate a watercolor style when my only traditional experience is with acrylic, which is not even vaguely similar in terms of use, at least how I use it. It's also difficult to emulate the style of an artist whose style itself isn't very consistent, and has significant differences in rendering depending on the piece, leaving me wondering which aspects to take from each one in my own rendition. But again, I did my best, with a myriad of newly bought Procreate watercolor brushes and the driving force of my love of Vanitas and Noe. I think the eyes were where I succeeded the most, largely because the eyes are the most consistent element through Mochijun's work, even when other stylistic elements are subject to significant variation. And while I don't think the watercolor rendering was particularly successful on my part, it was a lot of fun to work with and learn from, and it made me a lot more interested in working more in that style in the future. Overall, amazing experience, but doesn't hold a candle to the true Mochijun style in my opinion. And that's even more true for this next one, Raikoart. This was by far the most ambitious style I chose to try to copy, because Raikoart works for Riot Games, and has a very polished, semi-realistic style as a result. The reason I included them in this challenge was because I knew I would fail. I am not on their level at all in terms of skill, and I've always struggled with semi-realism. But I wanted to use this chance to try anyway and learn from that failure, as well as from the experience of trying at all. And as it turns out, I did fail. I also learned a lot. But before we get into that, let's go over the breakdown of their style. As I mentioned, they're on the very realistic end of the semi-realism style, with detailed rendering of textures, especially hair and metal. They use a combination of soft and hard shading and highlights, often emphasized by dramatic lighting, which is why I wanted to use this piece in particular as source material given the rim lighting. Even hard edges, though, are still slightly smudged or blurred. They use little to no line art, instead using light and shadow to separate specific elements. Their base color palettes aren't always particularly vibrant, but are instead given depth by using stronger, more saturated shading and highlights. Finally, the way they render hair is less by giving it detailed strands and more by emphasizing dramatic shapes in it and then adding detail to those shapes after. Using that, I made this. I hate it, but I knew I would hate it, and I'm okay with hating it. I've done studies without line art before, but not often, and I'm not good at it, so that alone was a challenge. Still a challenge I found helpful to learn from though, which was the case for pretty much every aspect of this piece. Semi-realistic face shading is the bane of my existence and potentially what I struggled with the most. But again, as I keep saying, I did my best. Blocking out hair shapes was was another thing I struggled with, but looking back, I think I have a better understanding of how and why I failed at it. In Raikoart's work, they taper off those shapes in a way that I didn't, with the light part of the shape starting thin and ending wide to reflect the flow of the hair. I did that okay with this particular strand of the pink hair, for example, but for the blue, I did separate strands based on areas of shadow, but their basic shapes were just flatly consistent as if they were just flat shapes and not flowing hair. It's hard to articulate in words, but I get it now, and I think if I did this over again, I could use that understanding to do it better. I also struggled a lot with knowing when to blur an edge and how much to blur an edge, but again, through this experience, I got a better understanding of it, although not perfect. Overall, yes, I hate this piece, and I almost gave up on it upwards of 10 times, but I'm so glad I made it anyway, because it was such an amazing learning experience. And that finally brings us to the end. I had a genuinely incredible time trying to break down my favorite artist styles and learn from them in my own work, and I would strongly encourage anyone out there watching this to challenge themselves to do the same with their own favorite artists, because it's so valuable and helpful when it comes to both improving your skills and understanding what stylistic elements actually appeal to you in the styles of others. I absolutely loved making this video from start to finish, and I'm so excited to get started on part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments, because if you did, I would be happy to make this an ongoing series beyond just 2 parts. Like I said, I have a million different artists I look up to whose styles I would love to steal for your entertainment. I just need to know whether or not you'd actually want me to. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Juho Usi Hakimo, Haruki Kenway, Art of Amethyst Fable, and Zelda Deverak 42, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Elengshi, Kim Yen, Shamil Sheep, Crazy Hisar, Gentong, Jacobus Peterson, Grayson Xavier, Eeyore Hiha, MG, Blamage, TC Pratt, Finn, Stephen Jett, Ash W, Inside Chaos, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Uluru, and Greg Noble for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.